If Jesus was willing to give himself up for us, he won't give up on us. If Jesus was willing to give himself up for us, he won't give up on us. If you're going to summarize everywhere I was going to try and go this morning in one sentence, that wouldn't be a bad place to start. If Jesus was willing to give himself up for us, he won't give up on us. I was going to preach on something else, and during the week I just felt that God wanted me to go somewhere else, and this passage. Are we on? Can you hear me? Brilliant. We're back in. Where was I? Was going to preach on something else, but felt that this was a better place to take us, a passage that just lifts our hearts and focuses on something wonderful. It's obviously a massive passage of Scripture that you could spend a lifetime in. There's so many things in here that we could dig really, really deeply into. And in many ways, I just want to share a few thoughts that have just come out of it that have been helpful to me, and hopefully will be helpful to you as we go into a new week together. I've kind of got three sort of things that I'm going to shape things around. So we're firstly going to see that we have one shared present. Okay, that's present as in time, not gift. One shared present. We're going to see in this passage that we see two superlative prayers. Superlative prayers, not prayers you pray, but people who pray. Two superlative prayers and three secure positions. One shared present, two superlative prayers and three secure positions. If you scan your eyes down those first few verses, it talks about suffering, present suffering, time, present time and sufferings at this present time. It talks about creation waiting in eager expectation, verse 19. Verse 20, creation subject to frustration. Verse 21, bondage to decay. Verse 22, the whole of creation has been groaning. Verse 23, we ourselves groan and wait eagerly. Verse 24, it talks about hope. Verse 25, it talks about waiting patiently. I think it's probably a fairly common experience. It's fairly normal for people, when they look at the news, to feel sad and just burdened about the state of the world. And it's not uncommon for us in our lives as we go through the business of daily life to have periods of time where those words are very true for us, aren't they? Suffering, eager expectation of things being changed, frustration, bondage to decay, groaning. And I wonder whether maybe there's an element of your week that's felt like that. Maybe those are words that are very pertinent to you at the moment. Suffering, frustration, bondage, groaning. And I sometimes wonder when this happens to us, we kind of feel like this is not normal, that it shouldn't be like this, that there's an expectation that somehow things have been unfair for me at this point. And yet actually when you read this passage, it seems really clear to me that Paul is saying that the whole of creation has shared this ever since the moment that Adam and Eve first turned their backs on the Lord. That we all share this present. Sometimes we feel those sufferings, we feel that frustration, we feel that bondage to decay, we feel that groaning very heavily. There are times and seasons in our lives when those words are very, very pertinent to us. But I wonder whether something that this passage helps us to see is that we shouldn't be surprised by that. And we shouldn't feel that if we're going through a season that is like that it's somehow unfair on us in a way that it's not been unfair on other people. That we live in a fallen world, we live in a broken world, and Paul talks about the whole of creation groaning. There are days when our groans will be very, very raw. but it is a shared present. It is something that every member of creation has experienced ever since the first moment that man and woman turned their back on the Lord who loved them. We have a shared present of groaning, suffering, frustration, and decay. And we read something as a team this week that just talked about whether we kind of sometimes feel like God hasn't been fair on me in my situation, that God somehow has let me down, God somehow betrayed me in allowing me to go through some of the circumstances that I face. And I don't want to play that down. I don't want to play down at all the fact that there are definitely times when you receive bad news, whether personal bad news or bad news as a group of people or bad news as a nation, that frustration and groaning are our only response. And yet frustration and groaning are the shared present of every human being who's ever walked the earth. That if we're experiencing frustration and groaning, that we're careful not to go, God's been unfair on me. Actually, it's the status of everybody who lives in a fallen world. And to recognize that all of us are walking through that same shared present. Some of us feel it more rawly at certain times than others. And I don't want to play that down in any way. But all of us walk through this shared present of frustration and suffering and groaning. But there's also another element of the shared present that hopefully puts some hope. We're going to skip over a little bit and into verse 28. He says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Part of our shared present is that somehow in that frustration, in that groaning, in that suffering, in that decay, God is working for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. That is part of our shared present. Somehow amongst frustration, suffering, groaning and decay, God is working for the good of those who love him. And there are times when it's really important to remind ourselves of that, isn't it? And there's times when we're really aware of that. There will be times when it's really clear that God has been at work for the good of his people. Sarah maybe could relate that verse to her experience of, I had a really disappointing discussion time on that camp. I had a discouraging experience. But actually God was working in that circumstance for the good of those who love him. He was bringing a girl to trust in him through an experience that for Sarah at the time seemed frustration and a groan at the end of camp. So that didn't go well. That wasn't how I wanted it to be. And yet God was working his purposes out through that circumstance. And I think maybe it's helpful for us to kind of hold those two things in tension at the same time. That for those of us for whom suffering and groaning and decay is a very real presence at the moment, God's not being unfair. It's a shared present of a fallen world. But at the same time, we have to hold to the trust that he is working for the good of those who love him through those circumstances. So that's our shared present. But there are other encouragements in this passage. Hopefully you're well aware of those just reading them, but I'm going to try and unpack some a little bit for us. And one is one that's probably not jumped out to me in a way that has before I read this week, that amongst the encouragements in this passage are two superlative prayers. When we find ourselves in those difficult experiences of groaning and decay and sadness over our situation, hopefully our response is to pray. And sometimes we will feel like I'm the only person praying about this situation. I'm alone in this. And are my prayers good enough? Are my prayers adequate? And yet this passage tells us about two other people who pray with us. In verse 26, in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We don't know what we ought to pray for. I wonder if that's been your experience this week. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. The Bible's telling us that God's own Spirit prays for us in those experiences of groaning and frustration and sadness that we don't know how to handle. God's own Spirit prays for us. And there is no better prayer than God's own Spirit. It says in verse 27, the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. Sometimes maybe we struggle with our prayers because we just think, I don't know what the right thing is to pray here. What should I pray in this situation? Am I okay to pray the thing I want to pray? But there's this incredible encouragement in this passage of saying the Spirit himself is praying for us, and he's praying in accordance with the will of God. And you know what? He's not the only one. In verse 34, it says, Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. I'd never seen that link before reading that passage this week. There are two superlative prayers, two people who cannot pray better prayers because they are God's part of God himself. God the Spirit and God the Son pray to God the Father in accordance with the will of God on my behalf. On those days where you just think, I am totally alone. I don't know what to pray. I don't know if I can pray. I don't know what I'm allowed to pray. This passage tells me there are two superlative prayers praying on my behalf. God the Spirit and God the Son interceding with God the Father and praying in accordance with the will of God. I don't know about you, but I find that a massive relief and a huge encouragement. And there's also a really interesting phrase here, isn't there? It says the Spirit intercedes for us through wordless groans. And there's this sense of God's own heart going, oh, come on. This is awful. This situation is awful. This is the product of a fallen, sinful, broken world that's been damaged by the devil. This is awful. A commentary I read this week said there's a helpful indication in this that a groan might sometimes be the most spiritual prayer. I don't know if you found yourself this week just going, I don't know what to pray. A groan might sometimes be the most spiritual prayer. There's a quote I'm familiar with that says, better in prayer, better a heart without words than words without heart. Better a heart without words than words without heart. I went online to find out where it came from. It's attributed to Mahatma Gandhi and also to John Bunyan. It's possible that Mahatma Gandhi said it, but given that John Bunyan died 200 years before Gandhi was born, I suspect Bunyan probably got there first. So better a heart without words than words without heart. Sometimes a groan is the most spiritual prayer. Maybe you found yourself this week just not knowing what to pray or what you're allowed to pray. There are two superlative prayers who pray on our behalf in line with the will of God. And then that leads us into three secure positions. I don't know what the future holds. Whatever situation you find yourself in that is leaving you frustrating and groaning, I don't know what the future holds. But at the same time, I do know what the future holds. This passage gives us a no and a yes to that. There are 4 questions in this passage. I don't know if you picked them out as Marley read them. In verse 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? There are 4 who's. Who can be against us? Verse 31. Verse 33, who will bring any charge against those who God has chosen? Verse 34, who is the one who condemns? And verse 35, who shall separate us? There are 4 questions. I think the middle 2, verse 33 and 34, are linked. So I'm going to deal with them as kind of 3 different situations that leave us with our 3 secure positions. Okay? Who can be against us? Verse 31. Who will bring a charge and who will condemn us? 33 and 34. And who will separate us? And the answers to those questions are no one, nothing, and never. No one, nothing, and never. The first one, who is against us? If God is for us, who can be against us? It's an interesting question because it's not saying no one can be against us. Maybe it does feel like there are people against you even today. It's not saying no one can be against us, but it's giving us that comparison. Hang on a minute. if you have given your life to trust Jesus, if God is for us, who can be against us? Comparatively, whoever is against us, who are they in comparison to the one who is for us? Maybe it does feel, maybe there really are people who are against you at the moment, but comparatively to who is for you, who can be against you? And the amazing thing is, God is not against us. It might feel like God is against us. You read about, suffering, frustration, bondage to decay, groaning. It might feel like God is against us, but he's saying it isn't that. God is not against us in this situation. How do we know that? Because of what we're told in verse 32. How do we know God is not against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? It's a complicated sentence, but it's basically saying God was willing to give his son, his greatest gift, his most precious thing. That is evidence that he is not against us. He is willing to give us his most precious thing. And if he is not against us by giving us his most precious thing, if he's willing to give us his greatest gift, is he not therefore willing to give us lesser gifts as well? Is he going to withhold lesser things if he's willing to give us the greatest thing? There's no rationale in that. I'm going to give you the most precious thing I own, but I'm going to hold back the things that are a bit less precious. The logic's obvious. It doesn't make sense. If he's willing to give us the most precious thing, he's not going to withhold lesser things from us. So when he promises us peace, when he promises a place in heaven, when he promises us hope, when he promises us forgiveness, when he promises us guidance, when he promises us blessing, when he promises us support, when he promises us wisdom, when he promises us his presence, all those things are lesser things that he says he will give us. If he's already given us the greater thing, won't he give us those things as well? Other things, other people might seem that they're against us, but God is not against us. And in comparative to God being with us, does it really count who's against us? Doesn't take away the pain, doesn't make it less difficult, but knowing who is with us is in a secure position. As I said kind of at the beginning, if Jesus was willing to give himself up for us, he won't give up on us. If he was willing to give himself up for us, he won't give up on us. Question number 2. Who will bring any charge against those who God has chosen? Who is it who condemns? Bringing a charge is like an accusation. You did this, you did wrong. And the condemnation is therefore you're guilty and you deserve punishment for that. But they're kind of linked as a concept. Who will bring any charge? The people who bring a charge and an accusation against you are the ones who you've hurt, aren't they? You did that. How dare you? You're guilty of this. You deserve to be punished for that. Who will bring a charge? Who is the one who has most evidence against us? Who is the one who has the greatest reason to condemn us? The most things to bring a charge against us? It's the one who knows our hearts. God himself knows our hearts. He knows everything about us. As I've got older, I've kind of got into that age bracket where people think I know the answers to things. And they come and ask me questions about life and stuff. And it's quite a strange bracket of age to be starting to move into, because I'm like, no, hang on a minute. I go and talk to so-and-so about those things. But now people are coming and talking to me. And I found myself, as a kind of someone in a sort of Christian leadership position, occasionally finding myself in conversations with younger men and women who come to confess. They come to confess things about themselves that they know God is unhappy about and they need some help with. And occasionally I've had conversations with people who told me things that nobody else knew anything about. Nobody knew anything about. So nobody could ever accuse them of those things because nobody knew. And occasionally people have told me things that I knew nothing about and seemed completely out of character. It's like, you don't seem like that kind of person. I'm really astonished that you're struggling with this because you just don't seem like that. There's no way that I would accuse those people of those things because they seem so out of character. I would not be able to accuse them. I would not condemn them for those things because I don't know anything about them and they don't seem to fit with what that person's like. And they could say, no one can accuse me of that. But actually, there is someone who could. Jesus, who knows their hearts, is the one who's able to accuse them. And yet, what does it say he does here? Verse 33, instead of accusing, he justifies. I'm going to declare you innocent. I know everything, every single thing that you could be accused of, every single thing that you could be condemned for, every single thing that you deserve punishment for, I know. So who's going to accuse you? I don't know if you ever watched Jeremy Kyle show. It was a terrible program sort of in the early 2000s where people with massive kind of family problems or concerns would kind of come on the TV and sort of shout it out amongst each other live on television. And often what would happen, they'd be kind of somebody who was suspicious that their partner was cheating on them. And they'd get the partner out in front of the crowd and in front of the TV cameras like, you know, this happened and this happened. I've got all this evidence of the fact that you're cheating on me. And then there'd be all big uproar and la la la. There's this kind of public accusation. But I wonder how a Jeremy Kyle program would go if the person who was accused and the person who's being hurt, so there's a couple come on stage, and there's a man and a woman, and somebody else comes on and goes, he did this, he said that, he cheated you on that way, he's done this, he's let you down, he's been unfaithful. And the wife goes, I know. And I've forgiven him for all of it. Where's the accusation? But, I know all of it. And I know more than you've told me. And I've forgiven him for all of it. That's the picture of what's going on here. Who can accuse us? Who can condemn us? When we stand before the one who knows everything about us, our record is cleaned by him. And any punishment that we feel that we deserve or anyone else feels that we deserve, he's paid for on the cross. Jesus himself paid. Because of Christ's death, any accusation or condemnation is already dealt with. If the one who has the most evidence is willing to clear us, what other accusation will stand? If I had accepted verse 32 for myself, Jesus gave himself up for me, he paid for my sin, then I am secure. My position is secure. Who can condemn me? No one. Because he's dealt with that condemnation himself. And then thirdly, the third big question, who shall separate us? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height or depth or anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Who will separate us? No one. What will separate us? Nothing. When? Never. How certain? Convinced. Our position is secure. I guess many of us live separated from the ones we love. We've moved up from South Wales. I was working out the other day that of my oldest and closest friends, I can only think of 2 people who live within 200 miles. And of my family, none of them live within 200 miles. I began to wonder maybe whether it's something to do with me. But none of the people who I would say I hold great affection... Sorry, that's a terrible thing to say in front of you guys, isn't it? None of the people who are really deeply close to me and have been long, long friends, I'm separated from. I hardly ever see them. It's really hard to feel a sense of connection with those people. And yet God is saying to us that that separation from his love can never happen. Never. Nothing will separate us. No one will separate us. It will never happen. That doesn't take away the hardness. And not to say that things aren't going to feel difficult. We need to remember point 1. There is one shared present of frustration and suffering and groaning. He's not saying that those things are therefore not going to happen. we still experience that shared present. But we have this secure position in that shared presence of knowing that we can never and will never be separated from God's love. If verse 32 is true for us, that he gave his own son for me, and I have accepted that sacrifice in my place. If you believe verse 32, then all those promises of verse 35 through to the end of the passage are true for you. Your position is secure. Who can separate you? No one. Nothing, never. How certain is that? I am convinced. A shared present of frustration and groaning, but God working for the good of those who love him. 2 superlative prayers who pray on our behalf in line with God's will. And 3 secure position. Who is against us? Not God. Who can condemn us? No one. Who can separate us from his love? No one, nothing, and never. If Jesus was willing to give himself up for us, he won't give up on us. If Jesus was willing to give himself up for us, he won't give up on us. We're going to sing a song that celebrates that together. Hopefully you're